Hello and welcome to the Trail and Adventure Motorbike Podcast with me, Clive Barber, and my good mate, Noel Tom. For the days when you can't ride your bike, there's always the Trail and Adventure Motorbike Podcast. Welcome to the 25th episode of Season 3. 25th and final episode of Season 3. As I said before, we're taking a bit of a break over Christmas. So a word of warning before we go any further with this podcast. If you've come here and you're not really interested in bikes to hear exciting adventure stories, then you've come to the wrong episode. This is pure sprockets and bollocks. With thanks to Steph for that little phrase. We're talking to Joe Mercer from Desert Rose and Adam Mitchinson from Rally Raid. And we're talking purely about bike preparation and maintenance. So if that ain't your thing, switch off and go and listen to something less boring instead. Show. We will be back in the new year, and we've got several fantastic guests lined up, which is quite unusual for us to actually be this organised and have people planned throughout the month of January. It's almost like we know what we're doing these days. Don't let us fool you. Right, without further ado, let's get on with it. We did a podcast before with Joe, Adam, and we basically talked about him and Desert Rose and what he does for a living and all that kind of good stuff, working on rally raids and things like that. And it was brilliant. But what we didn't do was talk about bike prep and bike maintenance. And Joe rightly pointed out that would actually be a really good episode.
It's quite a big part of it, isn't it, really? So it's worth covering.
Obviously, a lot of it is applicable to people that ride rally raids, but I thought it'd be really good as well for your average trail rider like me, just to make sure that they're doing all the right bits of maintenance and preventive maintenance and things like that, which pretty much no fucker does. But
you're still going from point A to point B, whether it's competitive or travelling, aren't you?
Well, exactly, yeah. And if my clutch having zero fluid left in it and things like that, it's just dick things like that you absolutely should check before you head out every now and again, right? And
I mean, that's contradicting what you said in the video, but yeah, we can go with that.
Yeah, it wasn't my fault at all. I checked. Yeah, anyway.
These things happen, were the exact words you used.
We've got Joe Mercer from Desert Rose back in the studio, or in his dad's kitchen in Kent, or wherever it is anyway. We talked with Joe a few episodes ago about his work at Desert Rose and lots of other things. But one thing we didn't really talk about was bike preparation and bike maintenance, and we thought it'd be really good to go into a little bit more detail on that type of thing. And also, Noel can't make it because he's fucked off to the bike show without inviting me, and he couldn't get back on time. But we've actually got Adam Mitchinson back in from Rally Raid, who is obviously, for this subject matter, much, much better than Noel. In fact, he's much better than Noel, full stop, in every possible respect. So, Adam, chime in with any questions or any of your vast array of knowledge of suspension and all that good stuff, which you have a really good understanding of. I reckon a really good starting point is to talk about, you've a customer, Joe. I don't know whether they buy the bikes and send them to you to Dirt Tech to get them prepared for a rally, or you buy them on behalf of customers, or however it works. But let's say, what's the typical bike a customer will use for some of the rallies that you run?
Most people these days are based around 450, 500 enduro type bikes. Typically, they are KTM Husqvarna brand, including Gas now. But there is, still quite a few 690s hanging around and the 701 as part of that. But as you guys know, the whole light is right type movement, then yeah, it's mostly the enduro-based bikes that we deal with.
So are you typically getting a brand new bike in for people?
It will vary. Sometimes we source the bike for people. Obviously, our kind of sister company is a beta dealer now, so betas will come through the Desert Rose network. Then some will bring them to us brand new, and some of them will be second-hand, anywhere from near new to, up to probably 10 years old. We still get a few of the older bikes through, especially guys that want to do more adventure-y type stuff. You know, a lot of people like the slightly simpler bikes. Some people still like carburetors. Who knows why? But some people do like carburetors, and you know, that kind of thing.
So what's the process then? You're presumably stripping them down. What do you actually do to them?
Yeah, so out the box, the bikes are pretty, you know, modern enduro bikes, generally speaking, are strong bikes. If we stick with sort of a KDM 500, for argument's sake, a modern enduro bike is a strong, reliable bike out the box. The key things we see are the same as sort of any brand. It's routing of wiring that could be improved. It's connections, greasing of connections so they don't foul up and that over time. And then the same as sort of a lot of grease and general attention to detail, whether that's in your headstock bearings, linkage bearings. These bikes are mass produced, so it's the quality control elements and, you know, the little parts. It will then vary a little bit depending on what the customer is wanting to do with the bike. So with a full rally type build, we'd spend quite a lot of time working through components and lock wiring and doing a lot of sort of cross drilling and elements like that. But for someone that's wanting to ride, I don't know, the TET or similar, that sort of amount of time being invested into the bike isn't really necessary. So, you know, we'll judge the customer, judge what they want to do, and then that's before you get to bolting any shiny goodies to the bike, really.
Are there any sort of really typical things that you pretty much need to do on every single bike?
Check they're screwed together right in the first place is kind of the biggest thing. You know, every bike when it leaves dealer has a PDI, but we all know, and this isn't any brand specific, that can be a varying level of quality. So yeah, that's probably the biggest thing. Torques on things like triple clamps and that, we've had forks not working at the factory, and it can be quite simple because the lower clamp is done up too tight, and you know, unless you know that, then it's not. Forks can be out of alignment, and then just getting the bike set up right initially for the customer. You know, sag is a big thing. It's something as simple as, you know, checking the freeload on a rear shock is often missed, and people can ride for such a long time like that and wonder why it doesn't ever really work for them. Obviously, not going to mention any names, but I may know of someone that did Dakar on a 450 rally bike and never did the sag on their rear shock. So everyone is sensitive and not to different things in the setup of their bike, if you like, and that's not right or wrong, but generally things can be improved on for sure.
Yeah, I mean, that's the sort of thing you do for your customers, isn't it, Adam? Even, you know, from whether it's a CB 500 or anything else, really.
Yeah. I think a point that was touched on there is like we have a massive overestimation of how much sort of care goes into mass-produced vehicles nowadays in terms of the consistency, especially on sort of road biased or adventure models. You can get away with a lot more. Obviously, the enduro bikes, I would say, in the grand scheme of bikes, are pretty well refined and manufactured compared to, say, something like a CRF 300 or Yamaha road bike. But the consistency in all sorts of things, especially over tightening of things as well, which is really important to longevity of the bike as well. But in terms of some of the Hondas that I've been dealing with at work recently, you have to get a massive breaker bar on the rear wheel nut, and if you did need to undo that yourself at the side of a trail, or when you haven't got a breaker bar, you'd be absolutely screwed. There'd be no way of ever doing it. Things like that to them doesn't even come into their mind in assembly, you know. As long as that wheel doesn't fall out and kill a customer, that's really all that matters.
So would you say when you do get a new bike, it's worth all those fairly structural things like holding your forks in, holding the swing arm in, holding your rear wheel in, it's worth cracking those open and then re-torquing them back up with the torque wrench to the correct setting?
As long as you feel competent doing that, yeah, definitely. Like, it's the person that's assembled that is being paid for a very short amount of time and attention, whereas you have way more time and attention and it's your vehicle, you know.
What about greasing things? Because you often read and hear about criticisms of things that haven't been greased properly or haven't been thread locked properly.
A lot of linkages on a lot of new bikes are very dry. Axles, you know, real front wheel axles, you get it out, it's a brand new bike and it's hard to get out because it's completely dry and it's almost seized in, you know. So
when you say linkages, it's the rear suspension linkages, the things that the various brackets that are holding the rear suspension into the bike.
Yeah, I mean, the bushes, they generally put a very light film on them, but the bolts are always dry. The bolts go white and crusty within months, you know, if you're not careful. And then that just spreads to the bushing, doesn't it? Like on the old KTMs, like the bushing for the rear shock, if that ever got really in there, you just never get it out, you know.
So what do? You pack the bushing out with a bit of grease, stick a load of grease in there and put the bolt through. How do you actually do it?
My personal method is I just put a really thin film on pretty much everything.
Yeah.
I don't like overload anything because it's always just going to collect dust, sand, anything like that. If you put too much in, you can just collect more debris. It's going to cause you more issue.
Yeah, 100%. Over lubrication can be as much of an issue as under lubrication, if that's as much of a term. But yeah,
especially for you guys because you're in the sand a lot more than regular sort of riders. You can pick and choose certain lubricants that do work well for you, and that sort of, there is better ones and worse ones for each use.
We prep a lot of enduro bikes that are used for in the UK and on events such as Romaniacs and that. And I don't know, if you choose an axle spindle, we'll in the UK or enduro events, we'll put quite a lot of grease on that because it's wet and sitting in water and crappy conditions. In the desert, we try and avoid using any grease really on those kind of components. We'll often use a lot of butylene products, and they do like a dry chain lube and use a bit of a spritz on that, just help it slide in and out. But the big difference really, one is the conditions, so you don't want dirt and sand and grit building up on that. The other thing is that these wheels are in and out every night. So, they don't really have the chance to corrode in the same way as your UK bike. So it's your usage of the bike and what it's going to be doing also makes a bit of difference to how you maintain it. Just to complicate things even further.
Are you upgrading suspension on a, say you get one of your factory beta bikes or one of the betas that you sold it to a customer, are you upgrading suspension, or generally is the kit good enough?
It depends on the bike. I think the biggest thing that is ignored on a lot of bikes, Adam will probably agree, is spring rates. Everyone tends to, and judge when they're buying their new bike, they look at spec and look at the size of the forks and reviews on how the suspension actually does. But again, it comes back to making sure it's kind of sprung correctly and set up, no matter what the adjustability is of the suspension, making sure it's sort of set up the best for you. Once you've got that done, you're normally halfway there, to be honest. There is a big variation in some of the suspension components. But again, I always consider suspension to be a very personal thing. Once you get beyond budget point, there's plenty of guys that are happy riding fast and, good riders on stock KTM or beta or, choose your poison suspension. And then there's plenty of guys that won't ride on anything except Gucci cone valves and Kashima coated forks and this, that, and the other.
What else do you do? So presumably there's a lot of electronic stuff you're actually fitting to rally bikes as well.
So if you want to build a rally bike, it's like an idiot's guide to building a rally bike. So you have your new KTM 500 EXC delivered out the box, and we've already sorted the gremlins, if you like. We've been through everything, we've cleaned everything, corrected any wiring issues, we've stripped off what doesn't need to be there. On a race bike, that's namely, your additional lighting circuits, indicators, etc. We get rid of all that stuff. Then from then onwards, the first thing we generally look at is sort of the core of the bike. So we look at extra fuel capacity, because the bikes generally need to carry extra fuel. Most events these days, you're sort of, the European events, some of them are still getting on sort of 150 kilometers autonomy, but most of them are working to 200k now. So really you need a 12-litre minimum tank. Modern 15-litre tanks have got a lot more svelte. So most of the guys just go straight for a 15 because they're not those big wide things anymore. They're tending to put more fuel up and then down. If you're looking at the bike side on, the big complaint was that the 15 litre tanks of yesteryear were really wide between your legs. So whenever you were putting yourself forward on the seat, it got a bit uncomfortable after a day.
The service ones were crazy wide for like the old 525s and stuff, aren't they?
Yeah, they were a nightmare, and you couldn't put stickers on them either, which always upset everyone. So the existing fuel system of a bike, as in the fuel pump and the injection system, you leave that well alone. Fuel pumps on recent KTMs haven't been as good as they were probably, on the old bikes, even though the part number hasn't changed, but something's making them fail more often. But then from then on, depending on what event or whether they want to do events at all, we then start looking at sort of navigation setups. That may be what we'd consider a rally light setup, which would be mounted on the bars. Rally raid, actually we buy quite a lot of stuff from you guys anyway, so they're RNS arms, and the navigation kit just bolts to that. It all mounts to the handlebars. It's a relatively simple setup by the use of an F2R power box or similar. Then you have one feed that runs from the battery, and that will then power pretty much whatever you want up to a point. Namely, in a rallying sense, will run your ICOs and roadbook straight from that single feed. And that's sort of your setup for a European bike. And then if you want to go into the African type events, Rally towers didn't come about because they looked cool. Rally bike towers came about because we needed to bolt more stuff to the bikes. Now they look really cool and they've become a thing, and people want wind protection and that on their enduro bikes, which I get, they do look cool. But initially it was because we had to fit tracking systems, we had to fit additional GPSs, we had to fit, 10 years ago we were running 5 or 6 different satellites on the top of a bike, and they're like,
they're so minimal now, aren't they, compared to what they were before?
Totally.
Just in terms of the actual construction of the frames and stuff.
Yeah.
It's just completely changed.
Yeah, the whole bikes have got simpler, lighter, and they're carrying less fuel now because the bikes are getting on less fuel. We've still got Pats's 660 rally bike, and that carries 52 litres of fuel.
And you needed 52 litres of fuel then, because the bikes burn through them more quickly, but you can get away with 15 litres now.
Yeah, I mean, on a factory rally bike, you're still carrying 30.
So you've mentioned an RS Arms, F2R power, ICO, roadbook. I think most people probably know what a roadbook. That's the paper system that tells you when to turn, highlights hazards and all that kind of stuff. What's an ICO?
An ICO is a brand name. It's a trip meter. ICO are an American company. Yeah, they've kind of, I don't know why, but everyone calls them ICOs, whether they're made by ICO. ICO and RNS are the 2 main brands of trip meters that are used.
And that just records your distance. So you can then look at your distance, compare it to the road book and go, right, I'm at 4.9 miles. I need to turn right after that bush. Yeah. And there's also a dangerous little ditch there that I need to avoid.
Did I try and do a very bad job of explaining how a roadbook works without any visual medium?
Oh, yeah, go on. That would be fun.
For those that have never seen a roadbook before, imagine a piece of toilet roll with 3 columns that go down it. In your left-hand column is a number. That is your distance. In the center column, we call them tulips, but it's like a little pictogram. And it will have an arrow or some form of drawing dictating where you've come from and where you need to go. And then in the right-hand column, there will be additional information that you need to know. That could be that you're passing by a post box. It could be that you're going into sand dunes. It could be anything, basically.
3 exclamation marks.
Yeah, slow the bugger down. That's it.
That is a thing, is it? The 3 exclamation marks. It's like something dangerous.
Yeah, so the rallies will work on a danger system, if you like. So 1 exclamation mark, basically you should take notice of it. 2, you need to slow down. 3, you've got to really slow down, otherwise you're going to end up hurt.
3 is get your camera out for the next person.
Those modern roadbooks are electric, right? I can't say electronic. You can push a button and it'll automatically scroll through them.
Exactly that. They're electrically powered. Some people think they're sort of automatic. They're not. They're still manually operated. So you do either have a toggle switch or some work on push buttons that roll them through. So they're controlled by the rider. So as your numbers in your trip meter are going up and your road book, no longer correlates to that trip meter, you press a button to wind it on until the next tulip becomes relevant, if you like.
Some people have more than one ICO, don't they?
On the big events, a lot of the guys will run 3. They'll bring in another name, which is another kind of fish, the ERTF units, which ERTF are a French company, and they have essentially the monopoly on the FIM events. So Dakar, Africa Rica Race, Morocco Desert Challenge, Raid Rock, that level of event will all use an ERTF GPS system. And then you have ERTF repeaters. So you have the main GPS on your handlebars and then 2 repeater units, 1 or 2, it's nice to have 2, that sit on top of the bike. And they relay the information essentially in a more convenient place that you can see as you're blitzing through the desert, the speed of sound.
They're quite large though, aren't they? To fit them, to find the space for them is quite hard.
Yeah. They're a different, very, I'm not saying because they're French, but because they're French, they seem to make everything a different format to every other product ever made. So, yes.
If you can have more stuff like that, it just makes stuff easier. Like having an ICO just to sort of play with and use to track back and stuff like that is, if you've got the space there and you're serious about whatever you're doing, it's worth it.
They'll often have multiple modes, and a lot of guys will just, use one for tracking their fuel. So they'll reset one when they fill the bike up. so they have a rough, log of how far they've been on that tank. Some will use them on the road to know when they're getting back, because different systems, depending on event, won't always log the whole route all the way through the day. So yeah, they all work a bit differently. There's lots of nuances in rallying. So yeah, but I can't tell you all. That's how I've made my career.
Fair enough. And presumably then they're not running off a sensor off your front wheel.
Yeah, they are.
They are. I just assumed they were like satellite.
Yeah, there's two versions. You had a traditional trip meter uses a front wheel sensor. So you have a magnet on the brake disc, and you have a sensor that then runs up. We normally bring them into your brake line that then comes up to the bars. And then some of the more modern units, well, not more modern, they've been around a while now, but use a GPS sensor that then sits facing the sky, and it logs you that way. The GPS units are great, easier to fit. They're a bit more expensive, but generally, less prone to damage, etc. The problem is that on any big event that they're not allowed by the regulations. So you have to.
And you can never get hold of them.
And you can never get, yes.
We've got the nuts and bolts. We've got the greasing things. We're tightening things. Thread locking. I pretty much thread lock. Every time I take a bolt out of my bike, I thread lock it back into place again. Is that good or bad practice?
Depends what you're doing.
Everything. Fucking everything. Every bolt that comes out gets thread locked back in. No, not some of the bigger ones don't. But things like, if I put a luggage rack on, I'll put a bit of thread lock on there.
Adam said, yeah.
When are you next going to take that bolt out? That's probably is the bolt going to cause harm to you if it comes out? And when are you next going to have it out?
So what are the bad sides of having thread lock on? Is that you're actually adding to the possibility of that bolt seizing in place?
Depending on the strength and the material of bolts, different bolts going into different materials can have different effects. So certain bolts, I've always found that stainless steel into aluminium is just like, if that goes in and you put too much torque on it, it just never wants to come out again if it's dry. But it depends what sort you're doing for your bikes, where you're not really maintaining them daily and stuff, and you're doing long distance trips where you're not taking loads of tools. It's going to be different to doing rallies where the chances are you're going to have that bolt out, like I said, at the end of the day anyway, and you're checking pretty much it takes like 2 minutes just to run over a bike and just check visually before you even start work on it that all the bolts are there.
And what about copper slipping? Some things you copper slip, don't you? Are there any rules? Are there any clear guidelines?
Marmite.
Yeah. It's a bit like, I don't know, you could... I'm trying to think of another controversial opinion that you could ask, but I'm running out.
It's funny that if I get a really old bloke come to the workshop, I whip the copper slip out and they love it. But if it's anyone else, I just use like Putoline racing grease and it's fine. But if someone mentions it that they like to use, or if I've taken the bike and I've copper slipped it, like I just leave it as it is with the copper slip on. I don't take it off.
So copper slip is just another type of grease, basically. It's an old-fashioned one.
Yeah, the only thing you can't confuse copper slip, most copper slips aren't really a grease. They're designed, once they're inserted, to actually dry out. The copper is there to be an anti-seize compound, but isn't there to remain slippy.
Isn't graphite like the other? There's a lot of graphite in them, isn't there?
Yeah, that's it. Yeah. So people using them in a place of grease normally is quite a bad idea, because the wet stuff in copper slip is sort of designed to be washed out or dried out over time. So people use them in place of grease. I think with modern greases and lubricants, there is a place for copper slip, but generally there's now better alternatives.
I think a tube of the racing grease, the Putoline racing grease, and a tube of the White Action PTFE grease is perfect.
Yeah, that's virtually all we use for 90%. Yeah, and so a little tube of red for anything on rubber, but that's about it, to be honest. So yeah.
Putoline Racing. What was the white one?
I think they call it PTFE, don't they? PTFE.
Yeah, it's White Action PTFE grease.
White Action PTFE grease. And what's the red one that you mentioned?
A red rubber grease.
Silicon-based one, probably, wouldn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Something that often comes up on events is, generally actually, is greasing chains or not. Where do you stand on lubing chains, Adam?
I'd probably run them quite dry compared to a lot of people.
I'm probably the same, to be honest. Yeah, I think it comes back to sort of over lubing and attracting dirt and shit. And then the problem is that people are always very keen to lube a chain, but never very keen to clean them.
Yeah, the more lube you put on, like you can get to the point where you just can't clean it off. Like if you're going to do it, you might as well do it once every 6 months, but do it properly.
Wow. Tell you what I do, and you tell me where I'm going wrong. So I will clean my bike.
Are we still talking about chains, Clyde?
We're still talking about chains.
Right, gotcha.
I will clean my bike after every ride, and
That's
I will.
where you're going wrong.
I'm sure I'm not. And I will use some of that muck-off type of spray, which is like a slightly acidic, isn't it, to help get the grime off. So I'll spray that on. I'll jet wash it, spray the stuff on, jet wash it again, and I will use that on my chain as well to clean my chain. But then I will always lube my chain. So my chain gets lubed after every ride, basically. And I'm using a spray-on stuff, so it's fairly light. And then I will get a rag and I will just pull the chain through the rag to get any excess off as well.
Do you blow dry your bike after you pressure wash it?
No.
That would be the best thing ever for it.
I will run the engine so to get all the water to evaporate off the hot bits.
To heat all those acids up left from the...
Just sprinkle it in lemon juice as well, Clive. That helps.
You don't have to take the piss. You could just explain how to do it properly, you fucking experts.
Oven cleaner. No.
Oven cleaner.
Go on, tell me how one should do it.
Just blow dry it. Airline, or you can buy like dog vacuum dryers or anything like that for like 30 quid. And I think it's hands down the best thing for if you've got a new bike and you want to keep it nice, or if it's something that you, I mean, like a race bike, or you just want to make sure that any bike really, for the investment, if you're ever going to wash your bike, I think airlining it, you'd be so surprised how much water comes out.
So basically I've got a compressor, so I can use that, right? And just to blow off all the remaining water, just to dry it completely.
Yeah, but the blow dryers are worth it. I thought they were a bit of a scam, but yeah, I found it cheap, and it was just because it wasn't a motorcycle, it was a pet one. It was pretty cheap, and yeah, the amount of water you can displace quickly, and then I just doused the whole thing in like WD-40 or something.
Yeah, water getting in places like on the KDMs, it was always where the chain, the clacker, if you like, but the slider that runs around the swing arm, one that goes top and bottom that runs around the front of the swing arm. There was two, I think, 5 or 6 bolts, 8mm head bolts that sat in there, and water just used to pool in there. And then it was a whole nightmare because they used to season the subframe. You had dissim the metals, and you for what could either be prevented, as Adam said, by blowing them out, or in honesty, ones that were regularly got wet, when they were completely dry, we used to remove the bolt and then put a dab of grease on it going into and then just used to fill the top of it with grease so that when water, any bits like that can't pool in. Again, it comes back to different uses, slightly different types of prep. The chain tugs in the back of the swing arm, steel bolts on normally an alloy swing arm. Yeah, they'd often get really quite stuck in. And somehow you'd get water into a swing arm, but you often couldn't get it back out again, so they just cause a nightmare. So that was actually one place where I still often do use copper slip. It might be the only place, but yeah.
If you're really sure that you never ever want to see.
So we didn't really finish on chains, did we? So you said you can lubricate a chain. How should you clean the chain before you lubricate it, presumably?
Kind of depends what you put on it. If you put something kind of heavy and oily, then form of degreaser. The problem is modern chains are really bloody good at containing the grease that they were fitted with from factory. So much so that depending on event and depending on customer, if a bike comes out to an event in a hot climate, fresh and new, we often won't lube it for the duration of that event. That chain will run dry, and I'm saying dry with inverted commas, because the important wearing faces, forget kind of about your mating faces, the chain and sprocket, is between the pins and the rollers of the chain. They are already full of grease, and they have O-rings, X-rings, whatever, Z-rings, I think they're on now.
Clive's aren't now, he's pressure washed it.
Clive's has no rings, and that contains the grease. That is the primary bit, and by squirting an extra bit of chain lube on, you're not affecting those surfaces at all.
Presumably, if you're running in sand, you don't want to put anything that is going to make sand stick to the chain, because you're effectively just creating a grinding paste then, aren't you?
Exactly that, yeah. Well, that's if you want to finish, I guess. But yeah, no, you're totally right. Anything that's sticky, we generally try and avoid applying. And that's not just in the desert. That's not just, on Dakar type events. That's even if you're running through Portugal on the TEP in the summer. Don't go clagging your chain with wet lube. It will just make a mess. They're a nightmare to clean. You just give yourself more grease and grief, actually. think about it.
So we're basically saying don't jet wash your chains.
Yeah.
How do you clean them then?
A little bit of jet wash, but not like don't spin the wheel using the force of the jet washer like I used to when I was a kid.
It's good fun.
Yeah.
And then give them a wipe down with a cloth, and then apply a light, dry chain lube.
Yeah, I mean, in wet, sloppy conditions, there is a time where wet lubricants are used. But anything that's really heavy and sticky, I think Muck-Off do like an endurance lube, which I'm not a fan of because it's really like sticky. You know, you can put it between your fingers and it's sticky. But yeah, there is a case for like a lubricant in wet, rutty conditions, because otherwise your chain, you know, they're still chains. They will rust up pretty quickly. If the conditions are dry, sounding dry, if you must, then I feel like we're both sponsored by Puceline this evening. But like they do it's a dry tech lube, which is mainly PTFE based. It's really good just to, you know, extend a slightly flagging chain slightly. But yeah, something like that's great.
They did used to have a desert lube, but that was oddly really sticky, wasn't it? It was like, I haven't seen it for a long time, but...
No, I think the dry tech has replaced it now, which is probably a good job.
That wasn't very nice.
No.
We've got our bike set up. We've just completed a stage. I'm wheeling my bike in. I'm a little bit tired. I'm hungry. I'm going to go for a massage and a shower and some food. I give Joe my bike. What are you going to do to it, Joe?
So the first thing I will ask you, Clive, is how was your day? And you'll tell me.
I've had a very nice day, thank you. I went very, very fast. Rarely dropped below 120 miles an hour. Currently lying in the top 3.
Okay, so
as usual.
The first thing is when anyone says about speed is unfortunately the ICOs record your maximum speed, so I'll be able to tell you if you did fly.
I haven't gone above 25 miles an hour.
They're also known as heartbreakers, those max speed readings. No, so first thing, you're wheeled in, and from a mechanic's point of view, we'll ask you if there's any problems with the bike. You know, if you had any issues with the bike, your navigation kit's working, if it's behaved as you expect your bike to behave. Second from that, I'll then ask you if you've dropped the bike at all that day. We obviously look around the bike a lot, but, you know, look at you shaking your head. I know you're lying already, Clive. In this hypothetical situation.
even in a hypothetical situation, I've still crashed somewhere, right? And gone really slow.
And Noel's hit you from behind.
Yeah.
Yeah, the reason I'm asking that is because it may have tweaked things that would not initially be apparent. You know, you may have dropped your bike on one side, may have knocked a radiator, may have knocked your controls or something similar. Then onwards, generally, I'll tell you to bugger off. And I may ask you, before I tell you to bugger off, I'll ask you what you're thinking about tyres and that for the next day. We always have things as very much a conversation, you know. If they're really okay, then I'll probably tell you that they're okay. And obviously, different customers are different levels of what they need. But if you want new tyres, then we can have that conversation as well.
The look on Clive's face right now is like he's imagining he's in this team rally situation and he's really, really getting into it.
I'm really excited. This is great.
The moment when you asked him that he could choose which tyres were fitted was...
But it's nice not to have to worry about the actual, because generally I buy Motos tyres because they just last forever. But now I'm going through a set of tyres every day and I'm getting brand new tyres every day.
You do have to pay for them, unfortunately.
Okay, leave the Motos on, they'll be fine. Top guys, they'll run new tyres every day, new tyres and new mousses, won't they?
Yeah, and in the desert, the tyre king still is Michelin with the desert range of tyres. They now do a desert Baja, which is slightly softer than the desert race because the nature of the rallies has changed slightly. They've got a little bit more technical and the stages have got shorter. But a desert race or a desert Baja is still king for most people. But yeah, the top guys will be doing new tyres and new mousses, and that's over 500 quid at the moment. It's money a day.
I think when you're putting this sort of money they're putting into their teams, though, like if having a rider either, you know, like a loose pop speed or something like that, having that happen with the amount of money they're dealing with would be embarrassing, wouldn't it?
Yeah, exactly that. And it's like any top level of any sport, but especially in motorsport, you know, these guys are going for any advantage they can. So the fresh edge on a rare can give them. It's often the fronts that will give you more of an advantage, you know, that stability in cornering at that really high speed.
That's the thing, isn't it? It's not the depth of your knobble, it's the sharpness. It's having the edge on your knobble still. That's the thing that gives you the grip, right?
There's a joke there somewhere.
Possibly. I'm not sure what it is, but We'll come back to it before the end of the show.
If only Mel was here.
Yeah, exactly that. And again, it very much comes back to, speaking personally, who I'm looking after. You know, how quick are you riding? Are you going to benefit of having a fresh front tyre? Or am I just wasting money for you? We will never spend money for you. I will tell you and insist when you need to spend money sometimes, but generally people are almost too keen to change stuff when actually stuff is just riding on quite fine.
Mousses. So I always used to run mousses just on my trail bike, simply because I didn't want the inconvenience of getting a puncture. And a lot of people said, well, just mousses don't last very long, but I would probably get about 3,000 miles out of a set. I think usually the front ones tend to, or you can feel the front ones when they've gone, because instead of bouncing off rocks, it's like you're hitting a pothole every rock that you ride over, and you know they need changing.
You can often feel them when they start to go on the road as well. As you sort of corner, you'll get a wob, 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 as you're feeling the soft and the hard spots in the mousse. And when they get really bad, you can get a quite horrible vibration as well. But yeah, no, generally speaking, a good quality mousse. Tonight's podcast is sponsored by Butylene and Mitchinson. Like a good Michelin mousse lasts a bloody long time. From a trail riding point of view, you know that they really are very good. The biggest thing that kills mousses in our experience is excessive speed on the road. Mousses don't like heat. That's what kills them. Off-road, it's never really an issue, because even when you're riding fast, that tyre is gaining traction, losing traction is as it goes over bumps, it's expanding and loosening, so it's getting plenty of relative time to cool down. On the road, it's sitting with one heavy spot for, you know, maybe hours at a time. So as a general rule, we sort of talk as 100 k's an hour is the magic number, so 60 mile an hour. Stay below that, they tend to be pretty happy for a long time.
That means you've never gone over 60, Clive. Sorry.
Well, that's probably true. Yeah, I just like the thought that you never have to fix a puncture out on the trail, which is great. But then they're expensive as well, aren't they? They're like, I don't know. The last time I bought one, it was about £100.
Yeah,
a mousse.
Yeah.
So
yeah, they are expensive. From a racing point of view, even at an amateur level, and my budget was very, very, very limited when I was racing. I don't know how much you kick yourself because you've got a puncture and you're having to, and whilst everyone's blatting past you, because you're having to fix a tube is worth any amount of money for paying for a mousse. It just, as long as you know how to spot when they're going, as long as you know the signs of when a mousse is worn out. A mousse failure on event now is incredibly rare. Like really, a mousse or tyre failure.
It did used to be quite common, didn't it? Maybe 10 or more years ago.
Yeah. Quite
commonly, you'd pop a mousse out the side of the rim or something or just a couple of batches. I think it was 2 years ago, Michelin had a couple of batches where they were just burning up instantly.
When everyone was switching to the Pirelli, it didn't help because Pirelli made a good rally tyre and they put quite a lot of money into Dakar. So everyone's running the Pirelli, but they didn't make a mousse. So everyone's running Michelin mousse with a Pirelli tyre. The combination wasn't right, basically. Yeah.
So presumably, Adam, because your dad owns a bike shop, so you're one of them spoilt kids that's got mousses in everywhere.
No, John likes mousses more than me, to be honest, I think.
Fair enough. I thought you just told me to fuck off for calling you a spoilt kid, but...
No, you're a spoilt old man.
Fair enough.
I don't dislike them. I think everyone's had a couple of occasions where a mousse has failed out the blue. Well, nothing's out the blue, but occasionally, it goes earlier than you think it would, or it could have been a bad tyre. If you do run a mousse too flat on certain tyres, you can almost stretch the sidewalls. Really risks the whole thing just coming out the side of the tyre on a corner, especially on the road and stuff like that. And like I said earlier, when you are running through a mousse, it can only take a moment of impatience on the road, and you're burning it up. You can feel it start to warm up, and you're doing it, but you're impatient, or you say you're on a road section, or you're trying to get back to the checkpoint, anything like that. But you can literally feel it going, and you just carry on. Once it's got hot, it's very hard to get it cool again without stopping, sort of thing. And any sort of solid surface, the bike feels like it's crabbing and just sort of doing the rears, especially when the rears start going. It's such an alien feeling, I think, compared to a tube and a conventional setup.
With a mousse, as they age, the pressure inside the mousse changes. So a new desert mousse I always reckon feels about sort of 25 psi. It's pretty firm. That's what you want when riding fast. You want a firm tyre. And then as they age, they'll probably be somewhere between 15 and 20 by the time they're fit for the bin. I think the thing we've found through the years, and we've had a lot of different brands of mousses, whether in customers' bikes or that we've supplied, is that the longevity varies a lot between the brands.
Do you lube your mousses?
Yeah, lubrication's a big thing. Yeah, they don't work quite so well for someone that won't ride all winter or, for 3 or 4 months at a time and then take it out, and you've actually got the lubricant's mostly dried up. And then again, the lubricant is there to dissipate heat. And as the mousse expands, it allows it to slip inside the tyre and vice versa. So, yeah.
I think the mousses themselves have quite a short shelf life, don't they, in terms of their construction?
For sure. And storage as well is a bit of thing, like on the big events, and you'll see them on top of our van. They're all strapped to the top of the roof, but, you couldn't store them like that for long periods of time, if you like.
So where did we get to on the daily maintenance then? We talked about tyres, and you were asking me if I wanted new tyres put on. I decided I did.
So at that point, I definitely tell you to bugger off. So, yeah, because you're now having me fit tyres. No, not at all. So now we've kind of established a job sheet for your bike for that evening. Regardless of if you don't want tyres and there's nothing wrong with your bike, every bike gets worked through that evening. Generally speaking, I will, and the way kind of Desert Rose does it is we'll work from each end of the bike. We'll generally start with wheels. So if those tyres and mousses are staying on, we'll have a good squidge, because you can feel hard and soft spots in the mousses through the tyre. I'll check the tyre for cuts and obvious damage to the tread blocks, as we're going through. As I'm doing that, I'll be looking at the rim in case you've clouted it on a rock whilst you were doing 25 mile an hour out as this car park. So I'll be looking at the condition of the rim, if there's anything needs addressing there, and then we'll work onto spokes. I check spokes every night on a rally.
How do you check the spokes? Is it
one of two ways? Either by sound and listening for loose ones, but I will only ever check via sound if I know that the wheel is built correctly and the spokes were tight in the first place. Don't just run a spanner around a newly built bike wheel and think that everything's okay, because you don't know that those spokes were tensioned correctly in the first place, if you like. So for that, I have a spoke torque wrench. They're not actually that expensive. If you want to get one, Talon provide them. I think they're about 50 odd quid or something like that.
Worth it for a new bike as well, because when a bike, especially a new bike, the spokes on some brands definitely tend to need a bit of a tweak after the first couple of rides.
So what are you doing? You're just putting a bit of tension into them?
So with a torque wrench, it will, like a normal torque wrench, it will click if it's tight enough. No, don't get into the habit. Personally, don't get into the habit of giving them a tweak every time you go out, because you will end up with an over-tightened wheel, and spokes do snap. And when one goes, they tend to, if you're riding fairly hard, they'll tend to follow quite quickly, unfortunately.
I don't have one of those torque wrenches for the spokes. That sounds pretty cool.
I'm just looking one up to see what they look like.
Tool jealousy. I just kind of do it when it just starts to resonate a little bit, and if it doesn't resonate, it's too loose.
And I think if you're always working with a new wheel or components, I think that's wicked. I like having the torque wrench to kind of give some sort of consistency no matter what else is going on.
It's like a baseline. You can get, exactly it's been done right, especially with, like we were saying, from the factory, they over tighten a lot.
Exactly that. Yeah, totally.
So that's quite cool then if you've got a torque wrench, because you can't actually over tighten them, but you're just putting the right amount of tension into the spoke.
Yeah, exactly that. So then from spokes, staying on the wheels still, we'll have a look over sort of sprockets. First disc, because obviously both front and rear have a disc. Check condition of disc. You talk about thread locking. Disc bolts are always thread locked, and that is one thing that we do always thread lock. They do like to back out, unfortunately, because the disc obviously expands and contracts through the day. So you want to keep them tight. And then move on to sprockets. And then with that, I'll then check condition of chain, front sprocket, the guard, then your clackers, your chain guide kind of thing.
What about brake pads? Presumably you're replacing brake pads fairly frequently.
Strangely, up until probably a couple of years ago, I replace a lot more brake pads than I do now. The materials now seem to last really well, but yes, we do change brake pads. But I had a very fast lad, do eco race on the same set of pads the whole way through.
Again, on my trail bike, because brake pads are fairly small, aren't they? You may start off with about 7 or 8 mil of fibre on the pad. When should you change them? bearing in mind one likes to get the best value for money.
A rally answer here is probably slightly different to a road answer. A road answer, you always want to have enough on there so that, if you end up doing a massive extended journey, then yeah, you're not going to run out of brake pads, which is why if you take your bike to a dealer, or a good dealer anyway, they'll change them probably slightly earlier than you think you can get away with, but they don't know if you want to be checking your pads, etc. A rally answer, I will always recommend that people start an event on a fresh set of pads, unless they are close to new, obviously. And then we have the benefit where we are checking the bikes each night in quite a level of detail that we can monitor how those wear. Adam might come in and he might have the same amount of wear on his pads as you, Clive, but Adam is stonking fast and on his anchors every day. So I might change his before I change yours. For me, there's no real set measurement. Is there enough? Is there any signs of the pad failing? We've had them break up and fail, especially if people have a tendency to drag their foot on the rear brake, and they overheat the pad. They can come away from the backing more than the actual pad thickness is quite an easy thing to look and think, no, that's fine.
No, I'm just thinking maybe 2 or 3 mil.
Probably is about that point. I've never measured, to be honest. You just look and know.
Those ones on the 310 that I pulled out in that video, Clive, before Spain were probably the wafferest things. They've gone through the pad and started going through the metal. The metal was 2 mil too thin.
Do what I say, not as I do, right?
And then we move in on the bike. So on the back of the bike, we'll move in up the swing arm. We'll check swing arm bearing, swing arm play, and then move to the rear shock, for any obvious signs of issue. There's an element on rally bikes. Sorry, on rally bikes. There's an element on bikes in a rally where there's a limited amount that you can practically do in the desert and in certain situations. And there is also... it gets a point with certain component failures where you, or components that are wearing, where you run the real risk of making jobs worse or a problem worse than you do for rectifying it. And that generally is sort of suspension type issues or internal engine issues. We're working in pretty crappy, dusty environments with
anything that exposes oil, really, isn't it? Because that's the big danger, is you get a gust of wind when you're doing your clutch.
Yeah, exactly that. Yeah, so we always kind of have to draw that line somewhere. It comes from sort of experience and knowing what you can and can't do and what you're comfortable doing as well. I can change a clutch on a KDM Rapido, but on a CRF 300, for example, where you have to drain the coolant system and out, it's a bit of a longer process, still fairly quick, but every bike's different. And 690, the new ones with the slipper clutches, you have to kind of build them outside the bike before you can put them in, and that's a right palaver, frankly, relatively speaking. So yeah.
So you've got a process then you go through. You've got a number
You're
of...
so uninterested in clutches from your poor clutch fluid behaviour.
Do we need to talk more about clutches then?
No, you're just so uninterested in them in your whole life. It's just, the one thing that you need to learn and listen to, you're not learning and listening from.
Sorry. And also, we had a discussion on you probably haven't listened to it, but I talked about not actually using your clutch when you change gear. You only need it when you set off, really. Just
very normal, isn't it?
I think so.
So I had a conversation with someone the other day and they'd never heard of it before.
It was Greg.
It was a different person to Greg, but we also had that with Greg, and he'd never done it before, had he?
Greg had never changed gear without the clutch?
No, he'd never changed gear not using the clutch. He thought you had to use the clutch every time, which is why he falls off a lot.
Yeah, he's only just got off his stabilisers.
It's a fair comment. You have a process, Joe, that you work through.
Yeah, long story short, yes, we have a process. We have a way that we work through bikes that you can never guarantee anything, but that reduces the risk of anything being missed on a bike. And that process changes slightly differently depending on which bike it is. Like I'll treat a rally bike, as in a factory rally bike, slightly different to an enduro bike. But yes, the process remains largely the same working through bikes.
And when you're checking bolts, are you actually getting a spanner on every bolt, or are you just looking or getting fingers? And
if the bike has been getting fingers,
well, just to go like that and see if it's loose or not.
Is that how you check your KTM? Fondling it randomly?
That's assuming that I actually check my KTM.
If a proper, again inverted commas, rally bike has been built, then we and most good builders will do quite a lot of lock wiring on a bike, and that removes on certain components the necessity to physically get a spanner on it, because if the wire is being applied correctly, it physically can't come loose. But yes, on everything else, I'm putting an 10 mil socket on that, 17 on your front sprocket, a 27 or a 24, 27 or 32 on your rear axle nut, or a 24 if you ride a Honda for some. That's it. So yeah, no, yeah, you are physically checking. Yeah, generally on time wise, on a desert event with an oil change, and obviously we're changing air filters every day. And in the desert on a rally bike, we're changing oil every day for the quicker lads, every other day for a more steady guy. It will probably come out to about 2 hours per bike per night.
Wow, that's quite heavy, isn't it?
It's very gratifying. It's like taking something. You're not the creator of it, but it's almost like someone that goes and looks after like art or gravestones or anything like that in a weird sort of mechanical way. And it's something that goes out and it gets damaged, and it's like a very gratifying feeling to come in and repair it and check it and know that it's performing as it should. Like,
it's like parenting.
Exactly. And I only have a dog, but I imagine it's exactly the same.
No, the dogs and children are absolutely the same. Oil changes, that's a good subject. Let's talk about oil changes. So when I bought my KTM 14, 17 years ago, whatever it was, in the book it said I have to change the oil every 10 hours, oil and filters every 10 hours. And the guy that sold it to me, who at the time was David Knight's mechanic, he said, no offence, Clive, the way you're riding, every 20 hours will probably do. What is the sensible way forward for? And another one is my CRF 300. It says oil changes every 6 or 12,000 miles, and I'm thinking I'm probably going to do it before then.
This is always a subject where like upsets everyone, isn't it? You know, where you say one thing, but the internet says another. The reality of my approach and our approach has always been that when you went and bought your KTM, whatever, your 450, and it says 10 hours on it, those bikes are built with the intent to be competition machines. So with a competition machine, they have to cater for your Sam Sunderlands, you know, of the rally world to be on them, who are using every single ounce of power and, you know, all the capability in that bike can put out. And that is what that 10-hour service point is built around. The reality is with your, you know, people plodding around on a TEP and this, that, and the other, it's hard to put an actual figure on, but you can stretch the oil quite a lot longer, considerably longer in some cases. Oil monitoring, as it's got more popular, has been really interesting. They had it on a few events a few years ago where you could actually take the oil motor there, and you could take the oil and they would analyze it for you and tell you the condition of the oil, and basically you could start to judge oil length. It was a bit strange because oil was free on that event anyway, but they still had a lab there. But even with a reasonable paced rider in the desert, using the clutch quite a lot in the dunes and generally getting that bike quite hot, oil was coming out to really be able to go 3 to 4 times the distance that we were changing it at. The other flip side of the coin is that oil is relatively cheap compared to rebuilding an engine.
So why risk it, yeah?
Why risk it? I think the biggest anti-changing oil all the time is when you see people's arguments against not riding enduro bikes, saying, oh, well, you have to change the oil every 10 hours. You don't. And that's not true for probably 80% of trail, travel, adventure, whatever type riders that are out there. You can go a long while and a long time on the same oil.
I think there's quite a few people I know that they always tend to say 1,000 miles when they're using the EXCs as like a trail bike.
Yeah,
1,000 miles is a pretty good, like, I think, at least.
I'd say that's right. It's generally probably between 20 and 30 hours, isn't
Somewhere
it?
about that, yeah. In terms of like just a general adventure use, not like you, Clive.
To be honest, in all seriousness, I would do mine about every 20 hours. That engine's still spot on.
And the other thing is that these enduro bikes, you know, a new 500 only holds 1.2 litres of oil. So, you know, you are talking relatively small amounts of oil that is in a bike, whether that's from a point that you need to carry it to change it, or whether that's from a point just how you're looking after it. The other thing is you can often smell it as well when it starts to go, and you can sort of feel it in your fingers. It goes kind of like quite watery and almost loses that slipperiness, if you like. You've been on the clutch a lot. It smells a bit like, I don't know, I always feel it smells like hazelnuts or something. It gets quite like nutty. Maybe
it's like caramelized almost, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think you two spend too much time changing oil in bikes to know that.
Probably.
It's a nutty bouquet with chocolate finish. I think there is a correlation between oil capacity and longevity, though. But there must be a point at when holding too much oil. Obviously, once you start tainting the oil in a bike, that will then mix into the untainted oil, and then you end up with a large quantity of mediumly tainted oil, if you want.
Yeah.
Whereas like the XCs, if you've got such a small capacity but you're changing it regularly, it's more of a flush than a leave it in there for ages.
The other big thing is temperature as well. Oil temperature, again, back to trail riding, the bikes don't tend to get that hot. Certainly not for extended periods of time. Yeah, you might get them hot, struggling to get up a river bed or something like that, but they're not staying hot for extended periods of time. And oil, for want of a better word, cooks, so if it stays hot for a long time, it does start to break down. The rally bikes have oil coolers to mitigate a lot of this, but that still affect. And the other really interesting thing that when we're speaking of motor is that they say the oil isn't actually best performing when it's new. Takes time to sort of break down, and for you're now beyond my chemistry levels, but for those molecules to break down and be at optimum slipperiness before it's actually performing at its best. So,
I'm sure at that level we're talking like toothpaste advert science, like in terms of the amount of difference that it would make. To like an engine running, for example, like in terms of I don't think you'd be able to feel that in the engine, that bedding in, would you?
Key thing is when an oil breaks down, it can't hold its viscosity. When it can't hold its viscosity, you lose oil pressure, and then temperature then exaggerates that. That's what you want to avoid. Along with deposits being built up in an engine, a KTM enduro bike shares the oil between its gearbox and engine, so you can have a lot of clutch deposits build up, if you're depending on how you're riding. So that is what you're trying to keep your oil clean, and you're trying to stop it being broken down. I don't think that's made anything clearer at all, has it, really? No.
No, I thought that was quite interesting, that bit, actually.
I've just realised this is just a big oil and tyre conversation. Claire.
That's good, though. People like oil and tyre conversations. They really do.
Yeah, they do.
They really do like them. So the last thing I wanted to cover, and maybe there's some other things that you wanted to talk about, was like preventative kind of maintenance. So things like checking fluids, whether it be hydraulic fluid, coolant, that type of thing, cables, cam chains. I've never even thought about changing a cam chain on a bike because they just don't do that many miles normally, do they? But I mean, sprockets and chains are really obvious. You can kind of see when the sprockets are going. Chains, I don't know about chains, but if your sprockets are going, I change my chain at the same time. Bearings is another one. People often say to me, don't jet wash your bearings because you'll knacker your bearings. And I'm thinking, well, I'd rather spend 10 minutes cleaning my bike and change the bearings that takes a couple of hours every year or something, rather than spend 2 hours cleaning my bike every day without a jet wash. Tell me what you guys think. Adam, do you actually clean? Have you ever cleaned your bike?
Obviously on like non-competitive stuff, change them when they're gone. Right? No point. I do change stuff. Before I went to Spain, I changed a couple of bearings just for peace of mind, because I know I'm the only person that works on that bike, so when it was done last, sort of thing. But like the general trail and adventure, until it's noticeably worn, I wouldn't see a reason to change it.
That said, I went out for a ride once and my front wheel bearings seemed to go fairly catastrophically, and I just had to wobble home, and that was, I didn't get to go out, and I'm thinking, well, maybe obviously
didn't your rear wheel do that as well?
That was in Wales, and it went
to stop it. Yeah,
it only went a little bit, and it was still kind of okay. It probably would have lasted, but you just don't know whether it's going to go.
There was 15-20 mil of movement in the wheel.
It's exaggerating. I reckon there's maybe 1 or 2 mil of movement. It was so slight.
You can see that sort of accuracy.
But yeah, talk to me about preventative maintenance. What should we be doing? What should people do?
Yeah, so the bits that tend to get missed, wheel bearings do get missed. Your rear, when a rear starts to show signs of play, I'll normally change it straight away, regardless. If a front shows sign of play, I will change it if I have the option to. You can normally get away with, and I am talking in the case where you haven't got the spares to change, but you can normally get away with a bit more wear on a front than you can on a rear. It seems to be the torque loading of the sprocket, and essentially every time you accelerate, it wants to pull the wheel out of line. Cush drive bearings get forgotten. If you've got a bike with cush drive, they get forgotten about. They don't really fail so much catastrophic. They just get really tight, and then they can overheat the spindle and the space that it sits on.
I find that I'm replacing the cush drive bearings more than the actual wheel bearings in some of the bikes I'm working on.
Yeah, for sure. When you get new bearings, obviously always buy quality bearings, whatever that is, SKF, FAG, a brand of that ilk, or genuine. And then often you can pop the dust seal out, the little seal out, and then get a bit more grease in there. That tends to help, especially if you are using your bike in sort of wet, muddy conditions. The extreme enduro lads and that, we try and get them in, because then you are more talking about keeping water out than you are actual sort of the natural lifetime of the bearing. Hydraulic fluids, you mentioned so clutch, brake fluids, they often get forgotten about as well, and it tends to be something that people only change.
I think that there's different types of bearings as well, just before we move on from that. Like needle roller bearings are way more prone to seizing, whereas a RSCM bearing is way more prone to coming apart, essentially.
So needle bearings, they're on headsets, aren't they? Or whatever you call them in motorbike world.
Linkages and that mainly. They're tapered bearings that you're on about in the headset, but all linkages pretty much nowadays have needed like 3 or 4 needle roller bearings in.
Why do linkages have bearings in? Why don't they just have bushings in that don't?
They're very high load, so the needle roller bearing spreads the load.
Right. So
if you put a normal bearing in it would just fall apart.
But why do they have bearings at all? Why not just a bushing, which would hardly ever go?
That would feel horrible.
Would it?
Yeah.
Okay. Just check.
Like riding a Harley Davidson.
Why don't we just get rid of push drive on every bike ever and
all suspension? All suspension.
Yeah.
Just get rid of it.
Banished.
Okay, that was a stupid question, I'm guessing, by the look on your faces.
I'm angry now.
I've got plenty more stupid questions where that one came from. So we moved on to we went to hydraulic fluid.
Oh yeah, fluids. People, I think it's too often that people only change clutch and brake fluids when they start to feel bad. And again, the fluid over time will start to break down the seals. So when it tends to feel really bad, then you kind of, I wouldn't say damage seals, but seals will start to deteriorate. Change it early. And, I'm not saying I'm not putting a time on it at all, but, just give your bike some love. Pop that reservoir cap off. And, if it looks hanking, then it probably wants changing.
So what about doing things like wheel bearings and cush drive bearings and fluids, hydraulic fluids? Just do it once a year for trail riding? Is that too frequently?
Too infrequently. Yeah. When you say trail riding, I think it's quite hard to judge. Are you going out every weekend hitting Welsh lanes in the rain? Are you going to Spain once on the over summer? I think there's quite a broad... It's a stupid question.
Well, thanks for your great answer. Arse.
Probably a way is if you can, and this applies to any form of maintenance, if you're working through a bike to a service interval, whether that's a manufacturer's interval or to your own, if you can start to judge the colour, don't roll your eyes, but the smell or the condition of whatever that item is that you're changing at that point, that's what you kind of want to get into the habit of doing, and then you can start to tell yourself, regardless of how many hours, miles, or I don't know, changes of weather it's had, that you can get into that habit. Because you can, on Romaniacs, we'll do rear brake fluid and clutch fluids every day.
Wow.
Have you ever smelt a wheel bearing that's gone, Clark? It's the eggiest, horriblest.
You're just making shit up now to make me look stupid, aren't you?
No, honestly.
I don't believe
every time I've
smelly wheel bearing. Do I look like a mug?
I'm deadly serious. Every time I've knocked like a rank old bearing out of a wheel or out of a linkage or something like that, it just smells of sulphur pretty much.
He's got a serious face, listeners. Maybe.
I'm deadly serious. Have you not found that?
No, I completely agree. Yeah, they just smell rank, for want of a better word.
Yeah, fuck you, Clive.
Excellent. So anything else on preventative side of things that we should think about?
Yes, suspension. Adam's probably better versed to talk about this than me, but suspension servicing for sure.
Because I read somewhere you should get your suspension rebuilt every 6 months, depending on how often you're using your bike. I've got suspension in my KTM that's not been... the fork seals would have gone maybe twice in the 17 years I've had it. But the rear shock has never been rebuilt.
No, it's so easy to neglect a rear shock because I think things change gradually as well. If you're riding a bike in a competitive sense, I think you notice changes during the day because it's a much shorter time frame. If you're getting that bike out once a week and going trail riding on it, I think things happen gradually and you can kind of miss stuff quite easily in that sense, I think. And especially like you get someone come in with a shock and you're like, oh, and when did you last have it serviced? Because you need to service those, unless it's like a very cheap, basic Honda road shock that has no adjustment and no working mechanisms. It needs some amount of attention at some point, and you get people doing like 50, 60,000 miles on a bike, and they've never once had the shock serviced or anything like that. And I think that obviously, in theory, the more money or the better your suspension is, the more time should be spent maintaining it, because it's not cheap stuff, and you can ruin it essentially by just neglecting it for many thousands of miles.
And that's the thing. I think Adam made a really good point. Time frames are different when talking competitively or like trail riding, but your actual scale that you're kind of working to is quite similar, or perhaps the other way around. I say go back to oil changes. On the quick guys, will be changing their oil every day, but they can be doing 8 to 16 hours in that one day. There'll be people at home thinking, "Oh Christ, that seems a lot," but actually it's not. That's quite a normal time frame. When we were just saying that 20 to 30 hours is probably not far off, where a lot of trail riders take it. So
yeah, depending on the type of the event, you'd be surprised at the distances that you can often cover, like especially things like liaison sections as well, which have got longer and longer and longer in the type of events you're doing. But even for just general riding as well, like it's a long day, like 500k. Even in non-competitive rallies is generally seen as like a big day, but a doable day in the fast going stuff at least.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and liaisons from a bike point of view can almost be the worst. All right, you're not hammering over off-road terrain, or at least not severe off-road terrain, but your bike on Eco and Dakar and those kind of events, you might have sort of 300 plus K on the road, and they're sitting at 80, 90 Ks on the road for hours on end, and that oil's getting hot and thin, and everything's just sort of droning away, and actually isn't.
I think there's some events where you have to go straight into you have to put it straight into Parc Fermé after the liaison, and then go straight into like a prologue as it stands, isn't there?
Yeah, and Dakar's changed now that you get 15 minutes before the start of the morning. So before the start of the stage where you get your road book, so you don't have any time of the morning to correct things. And on marathon stages, the bikes are sealed overnight. So as you said, they go to the Parc Fermé. So yeah.
So now they only give you the road book 15 minutes before, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, they've started bringing it in the last couple of years that the road books are handed out in the morning. So on Eco Race this year, it was at 1 hour. You got an hour with the road book in the morning to do all your marking up before your start time. I think Dakar is now 15 minutes. I'd have to check.
Wow.
So it's a short period of time. Yeah.
Well, with 15 minutes, you've only just got time to load it, haven't you, really? You can't mark it up or anything.
No, but the road books are now pre-coloured. So that's the big thing that's changed. What it's tried to mitigate is, we're going to go off on a bit of a tangent here, is that there used to be a bit of a thing called the map men, where the factory teams, you'd have a road book given out to you of an evening, and then the factory teams would basically have guys sitting in trucks figuring out where the route was going, and then they basically brief the riders on what to look out for. So they've tried to take that away.
Wow.
So,
incredible.
Or level playing field.
Yeah.
Do you think that there's still quite a strong necessity to mark your own road book, though, now it's covered?
Personally, yes, I do, because no matter... I think humans are like inherently lazy. So if stuff's marked up, you'll tend to only pick out what you want to, and you're a lot more for dangers personally. And if you for speed zones, trying to clearly mark them out to you, because if you've got a sea of colour, that's all nicely printed, you want something that stands out. And that's kind of my issue. But yeah, so. You can blitz through one pretty quickly and just pick out those triple cautions and the like, and focus on them.
Tell me about the GPSs you're actually allowed to use in rallies.
Again, like virtually every sentence I've said, it depends on the event. But what's equally as popular nowadays as the rallies are the raids, and the raids will tend to have a more GPS type option. So yeah, they will not use a road book, and you'll use a GPX file, and you'll basically ride along following a squiggly line on your GPS device. The king of GPS devices probably still the Garmin units, mainly the Montanas, but some people like the 276s with the bigger screens and that, but the Montanas are probably still king. Form factor, general ease of use, Ease of use is always lightly said when it comes to sort of Garmin products. And just sort of reliability and robustness. They're a nice unit. The 700 series is a big upgrade.
I think a lot of people look down on RAID classes.
Yeah.
I did one in Australia a couple of years ago on the APC. It's very fast. Like, I can understand how people could have more accidents doing a RAID class than following a road book. Because when you are following that line on the GPS, you take it so literally, and it causes so many like dangerous moments because you take it so literally. Whereas with a road book and stuff like that, you're using your own senses and information that you're sort of proofreading on the way in.
Totally agree. The big, when navigating on GPS, you don't get any warning. You know, there isn't caution marks and that marked in the GPS. And again, the other bit you said, that raids are really good events and shouldn't be looked down on as sort of inferior to a rally, because some of the raids, Illyria raid, for example, you know, you have to be riding pretty hard to get through each day, you know, and make the time. What they do remove, and I think we touched on this last time, Clive, is you know, the kind of buzz around timing and being competitive. But that doesn't mean that they're not a challenge and you know, you have to kind of compete with yourself. You know?
It almost turns into like a long distance hare and hounds with a GPS rather than because the navigation is such a big part of the riding. Whereas when you take that out of it, it just turns into who's got the goonies to follow the line, and not break sort of thing. Yeah,
totally. And the organisers on all the events that we attend at GPS are pretty hot on that for that reason. You know, they know that there's disadvantages to navigating via GPS, so they're always keen on briefing people to slow down. They'll often put in bits to make sure that happens as well. USB ports are the root of all evil. Don't trust USB ports. They just can't handle vibration. You know, it doesn't matter who yours is made by. You know, there are better ones, but just the design of a USB port can't handle being rattled over a bike endlessly.
Funnily enough, I've got a Garmin XT, and I first tried to use that using just it's got a mini USB on the back, just didn't charge. And then I put the proper bracket on, proper charging thing, and it works perfectly from then.
Yeah, for sure. They do, you know, I'm not saying they won't have problems, but they have less problems than running them via a lead.
I think they have less, they draw less. They draw more when they're in the rugged mount, don't they?
They do.
Right. Yeah. So that might have been what happened to your bike. It wasn't. If you put it in the rugged mount, I think it gets like 12 volts. If you have it on the USB, it only gets like 5 or something like that.
In short, look after your bikes, people. Keep them clean, but not too clean, and lubricate them, but not too much.
And send it, but not too much.
Yeah, sure. But stay on it.
Little send.
Adam, I can't believe you're on a fucking bike maintenance podcast. I've seen your bike, bits falling off it.
Fuck off. Every trip we've been on, nothing has ever gone wrong with my bike, ever. Everyone else's, but mine.
Yeah, it's true, actually.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. That's a great point to end. I'm ending on that one. Just Adam telling me to fuck off. Right, that's it for this year. Massive thanks to Adam and Joe. Really appreciate their expertise and their willingness to share it on here. So that's good. And hopefully there's lots of useful stuff in there for you as well. So that's the end of the year. It's the end of season 3. It's been a fairly big year for us from a podcast perspective. We've seen massive growth in the number of listeners, and obviously we've produced a lot of podcasts. Let's just hope we can carry on doing that. We can keep finding fantastic guests willing to come on and talk to us. Next year's looking pretty exciting. I'm trying to organise some kind of get-togethers, trying to find a venue that will host us for a weekend and get a few people together, have some beers, go out for some rides and stuff like that. We're also curating the stage at the Lightweight Adventurous Festival in July. If you haven't booked up for that, there's still tickets available. It was brilliant this year, and it's going to be hopefully bigger and better next year as well. And we're talking to a lot of people to come and join us on our stage and talk about things that they do and the things that they create. So it should be a good one. Hey, listen, have a flipping great Christmas, and may your stockings be filled with all kinds of moto loveliness. Oh, speaking of which, we've still got some T-shirts left if you want some. Happy flipping Christmas and a joyous new year. See you then. Thanks for listening. We really appreciate your support. Don't forget you can follow us on Facebook and Instagram. And if you really appreciate what we do, you could consider supporting us on Patreon or buy us a coffee. Links are available on our website, which is tampodcast.com, tampodcast.com, where we also have a limited selection of branded stuff. But either way, please keep listening and spreading the word. See you next time.